To this discussion now, ANC supporters of President Cyril Ramaphosa are hitting out at the so-called Radical Economic Transformation faction. Now, this faction supports African National Congress Secretary General Ace Magashule. Tensions between the two groups are growing ahead of a scheduled National Executive Committee meeting this weekend. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by Derek Hanekom. He is a member of the ANC's national decision-making body in between conferences. That's the NEC. Mr. Hanekom, thank you very much for making time to speak to us. Firstly, I'd like to start off with whether or not you agree with the statement expressed by fellow NEC member Joel Netshitenzhe in a Daily Maverick article where he says the ANC may be experiencing the emergence of an organization within an organization. Simply put, is the ANC experiencing a rupture?
Well, good morning, Xoli, and good morning to all the viewers. Your first question is really, do I agree with Joel Netshitenzhe's article? And of course, the answer is I not only strongly agree with the article, but I think it is a very good piece of work describing the situation in our country and the kinds of threats to our democracy and some of the contradictions that we have to deal with, not only as ANC members, but outside of the ANC as well, because the threats go far beyond internal threats in the ANC. So on the question of whether we're dealing with an organization within an organization, it has all the hallmarks of that. It has the hallmarks of a group of people that are seemingly controlled in the office of the Secretary General in Lutuli House, who are not only distorting ANC policies deliberately, but are also seemingly engaged in a campaign to have their own candidate elected as president in the next ANC conference. So it seems like an early campaign, but the way it is conducted at the moment certainly resembles something like an organization that assumes or tries to assume an independent form that claims itself to have the right to just articulate whatever positions it wants to articulate, but does so in the name of the ANC and evidently operates from the offices of the Secretary General in Lutuli House.
Yeah, so this is an early campaign, in your view, ahead of the 2022 elective conference. The person who is being put forward clearly by the faction concerned is Ace Magashule. Is that a candidate you would agree with going to conference for president?
Well, I'm not. At the moment, there are immediate issues that we have to attend to. We're not in the business of discussing who our preferred candidates are for 2022. At the moment, we have to deal with some of the wrongs in our own organizations, which have to be corrected.
Yeah.
There are a number of them. So I'm not going to venture into who my preferred candidates would be for 2022. And this is what we should not be doing at the moment. It's factional behavior. But we also know that the Secretary General, almost immediately after the Nasrec conference, said, we'll see you in 5 years' time.
Yeah.
And so we know that there is such a campaign. People may campaign and people may promote and support individuals who they believe would be the best suited to occupy certain positions in the ANC. But it's the way they conduct their campaigns that becomes a matter of concern to us who are elected leaders of the ANC.
Can I ask you this question, Mr. Hanekom? Why is this situation that you describe, and as described very well by Joel Netshitenzhe in that article, why is this situation allowed to happen when the ANC has resolved to adopt the step-aside resolution, particularly for people like the Secretary General who are now criminally charged? Why has he not been suspended? In the Eastern Cape, as I speak to you yesterday, the Secretary of that province made a number of announcements, including suspending some of the people who are implicated and who are actually going before courts right now. Why is there a difficulty to deal with Ace Magashule?
Okay, well, Joel deals with this in his article as well. And of course, the Eastern Cape are doing the right thing because they are giving effect to conference resolutions and the decision of the NEC. I'm not so sure that there's such difficulty in the NEC, but it might be useful if you have some sense of where we are with respect to the stepping aside resolution, if you like. It's taken a long time, but the NEC itself, I think in August last year, made the decision, and it was announced by the President with the other, with 5 of the officials alongside him. All 6 officials announced the decision of that NEC meeting that we would implement those conference resolutions, namely that anyone charged with corruption or fraud or serious offences would be asked to step aside or would be required to step aside, and other things. The difficulty, or not difficulty, but some of the things that have held up the process, firstly, it was then accepted that it would be useful to have a set of guidelines because various situations could arise. So it was agreed to by the NEC that before implementing the decision of stepping aside, that we would conclude these guidelines. Secondly, it was reported to the NEC that the Secretary-General, remember we're not only dealing with the Secretary-General's case, but in the case of the Secretary-General, that he had requested opportunity to present his case to the Integrity Commission, and that he was going to be given a hearing by the Integrity Commission, which has subsequently happened. So the 2 hurdles, if you like, have now been crossed. One is now we have an approved and adopted set of guidelines, and Joel correctly raises issue with how this was communicated by the Secretary-General, because these guidelines have been adopted and confirmed by Paul Mashatile, one of the officials, who was charged with the responsibility of developing these guidelines. So these guidelines have now been adopted, A, and B, the Integrity Commission did have that session with the Secretary-General, and they have recommended that he should step aside. So these 2 hurdles have been crossed. This has to be tabled at the next NEC, and the NEC will have to make a decision in this regard.
And that decision might be what exactly? Would it be to charge the Secretary-General or to actually put him on suspension?
Okay, well, obviously I can't preempt the decision of the NEC. The NEC must consider the matters in front of it as a body, as said by the Secretary of the Eastern Cape, the highest decision-making body of the ANC between conferences.
But as a logical step, I'm sorry to interrupt you, as a logical step and as someone who actually once led the disciplinary committee of the ANC, what is the next logical step, in particular with reference to the Secretary-General?
No, I'm with you, completely with you. But again, I can't preempt the decision of the NEC, but these are the considerations. These are the things that have to be agreed to. One is there is a requirement that those who are charged with these serious offences should step aside. So now that it has gone through all of these hurdles, that would, you're right, Xoli, that would be the logical conclusion, that the NEC would then say, well, you know, we've given opportunity for these guidelines to be prepared, we've listened to the Integrity Commission, and we are therefore now asking you to step aside. But that's for the NEC to decide. Should, in the event, and this is in the ANC's constitution, in the event that any individual who is asked to step aside, should that individual refuse to step aside, there is a rule in the Constitution itself, which is not simply a conference resolution, but it is in the ANC Constitution, namely Rule 25.70, that anyone charged with a crime can be put on temporary suspension by the organization, acting in the best interest of the organization, and that then rules and conditions of such suspension will be stipulated, but that person would then be suspended or temporarily suspended until such time as the court process has been concluded. Yeah. In the event of anyone being found guilty of corruption or fraud, the ANC's constitution is also very clear. That would result in expulsion, in fact. And it doesn't give much option. The ANC constitution says that if you have been charged and found guilty of fraud, corruption, racketeering, money laundering, there is no other option than expulsion from the organization. But that's at the end of a court process.
Yeah.
Right now we're dealing with people who have been charged and acting in the best interest of our organization. So that is a decision of the conference. I should say, and this wouldn't be new to you, Xoli, but the notion that, firstly, that I have been elected by members of the ANC at conference. Nobody can change that because branches elected me. Well, the very same branches that elected the Secretary General and elected me and many others to the NEC also decided that we are elected, but but we are still governed by rules and policies, and that we can be removed. Those same branches decided that. So, of course, the NEC has the power, in fact, not only the power, but the obligation to give effect to those conference resolutions.
Mr. Hanekom, let me ask you to stay exactly where you are, because when we continue, we're going to end this conversation in a bit, but when we continue, I want to ask you about the actions of the former President, Jacob Zuma, to defy not only the Constitutional Court, but to go before the Commission of Inquiry which he set up. That conversation in a moment. I am in conversation with ANC NEC member Derek Hanekom on the back of an article written by fellow NEC member Xoli Mngambi, who is spelling out the problems that plague the ANC right now. I want to go back to that article by Xoli Mngambi, Mr. Hanekom, and he writes, and I'm careful to use the word speculatively, but it's quite serious. In my view, he writes about units trained in sabotage and assassination, which units, he says, should not be allowed to dictate the terms of engagement. Who or what is he talking about there?
Yeah, thanks, Xoli. In fact, he goes further. Further and not further in some ways. He says that we may be seeing a situation in South Africa where we are seeing our own Savimbis and Blakamas, who were really sort of led rebel forces in Angola and Mozambique, for those who don't know. And so, we may be seeing a kind of the beginning of a rebellious movement. But certainly he does raise issue, as do the many signatories to the Defense of Our Democracy statement, raises issues with about inappropriate and in fact threatening military behavior or military-style behavior, the formation of what seems to be a private militia of people who are surrounding the president's house in Nkandla. And, he raises correctly deep concern about these kinds of developments.
And that's exactly the point I want to come to, because the question, therefore, Mr. Hanekom, is, do you believe the actions of the former president, Jacob Zuma, not only to allow these militia, as they have been described, by the way, not my words, but by the South African Council of Churches, for example, to allow them to station themselves outside the house as some kind of private protection for him, but also importantly, the defiance of the Constitutional Court order to appear before the Zondo Commission and his insistence that he's not going to go to Zondo. Do you believe that his actions threaten the country's constitutional democracy?
Well, firstly, his actions are obviously quite unacceptable, and the very reason why so many voices are coming out, the South African Communist Party, Council of Churches, business, because they do see this as a threat to our democracy, or we see it as a threat to